Hello, and thanks very much for joining us. I'm delighted to be joined again by my partner from the Kingsley Napoli M&A team, Glafkos Tombolis. Today, we're going to have a quick chat about things that the seller and the buyer need to consider in relation to what's going to happen after completion. We're going to have a look at what an individual seller might want to be thinking about, and also some questions that a corporate seller who are disposing of part of their business might want or might need to bear in mind to ensure that you hit the important marks of making sure the buyer gets what they're expecting and a business that can trade, and that the seller gets what's most important to them, which is paid. Glafkos, again, I know we've spoken before, but perhaps you could do a quick introduction for anybody who's new.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, John. Yes, as John says, I'm a partner in the corporate commercial team at Kingsley Napoli, and my main area of focus is advising business owners and also buyers on M&A transactions across a number of industry sectors. And I also advise on joint ventures and other business alliances and on general company law matters as well.
That's great. Thanks, Glafkos. So when we look at post-completion services, if you're an individual seller, you're selling your company, you're looking to make a nice capital gain and move on, why would you want to be thinking about what you're going to be doing in the business after you've actually sold it?
Yes, that's right. Good question. A lot of businesses are kind of people businesses, for example, digital marketing agencies, just to take an example. In those cases, the seller's post-completion involvement in the business will actually be very important to the buyer. And so the buyer will essentially be expecting the seller to stick around, at least for a period of time, to help integrate the business into the buyer group, maintain relationships with customers and maintain the goodwill of the business, which is why often on a deal of that nature, the consideration that's payable to the seller will be in the form of an earn-out or some form of deferred consideration, where not all of it's paid in cash on day one at completion. Some of it will be held back. Either it will just be paid after the elapsing of a certain amount of time, or it will be contingent on certain milestones or hitting profitability or revenue targets. And that way, the seller remains locked into the business post-completion, and therefore it would be difficult for the seller to leave. There'll be a risk that if the seller leaves before the end of the earn-out or deferred consideration period, they might not get their full payout. So they're incentivized to stay and run the business that they've just sold as profitably as possible.
And a key question for a seller, of course, where there is an earn-out will be, well, how much control am I going to have? We've agreed these terms on the basis that the business is run how I've always run it. And
Yes.
If you're the buyer, you're coming in, if you take control and start changing things and making decisions that are perhaps different from the one the seller would have made, then perhaps you're not going to hit those earn-out targets because of differing priorities or differing approaches. So it's really important as a seller to think, well, how much control do I actually expect to have over the business post-completion, even though I don't own it, so I can make sure that I'm going to get what I think I deserve for the business through the earn-out mechanism.
Yes, and that's a very good point, because as a buyer, your inherent position will be, well, I've acquired 100% of your business. I own it now. I've paid for it, and therefore the buyer controls it. So what typically happens is you'll have potentially sometimes detailed negotiations between the seller and the buyer at the time of negotiating the sale and purchase agreement, where the seller will ask for detailed earn-out protections. And again, they're essentially negative covenants or undertakings given by the buyer not to do certain things relating to the business without the seller's consent. So, for example, it can't sell the business, it can't change the nature of the business. Sometimes it won't be able to make significant hires or enter into litigation, things like that, without the consent of the seller. And those are quite contentious provisions, and they're usually heavily negotiated because there's this inherent tension, as you say, John, between the buyer that wants to control the business as it sees fit and the seller. And the main concern from the seller's perspective is that the buyer doesn't start doing things to artificially depress the profitability of the business, in other words, to result in the buyer not having to make the payout to the seller. And so that you'll see often detailed drafting around that in the sale and purchase agreement.
Absolutely. And even if there isn't an earnout, it's also always really important to make sure there is a meeting of the minds between the buyer and the seller in terms of that handover,
Yeah.
because even if it is just client relationships or handling the
Yes.
employees, making sure they don't
Yes.
all panic, that can be really important. So you've got to have a discussion at an early stage. I have seen
Yes.
examples over the years where we've had a seller who perhaps thinks, well, I'm going to sell my business and I've got my house in Spain and I'm off. I'm going to move there and, I'll pop back to England every once in a while. And the buyer is expecting that they're essentially going to remain full-time in the business for
Yes.
6 months or a year
Mm.
post-completion for handover. And if you haven't had
Yes.
those conversations and that meeting of the mind, it can create real problems later on,
Yes.
because obviously
Yeah.
those questions of where people are going to live, what they're going to be doing with their time, are very, very big, important questions in people's
Yes.
lives, and they can derail transactions. So we would always say, have those conversations at an early stage, and it might transpire that, actually everybody's completely aligned and it's very easy, or there might have to be some quite fraught
Yeah.
conversations. Better to
Yes.
get them out of the way before you've paid a lot of money to lawyers.
Yeah,
um, I,
definitely.
I generally find. And in terms of how those arrangements might work, would people always stay on as just employees of the company as they were before, or are
Mm.
there other arrangements you might occasionally see?
Yeah. So often in an owner-managed business, the seller will be a director. And may or may not have a service contract, especially in smaller businesses. Often the relationship, the arrangements are fairly informal. Typically, when they move over to the buyer group, the buyer will typically want to formalize that. So they may go across and there'll be a formal director service contract if they remain on the board, or there'll be an employment contract with all the usual provisions that you'd expect to see in an employment contract. What we sometimes see as well, or in the alternative, is that these individual sellers that are going across will enter into some kind of consulting agreement or consultancy agreement with the buyer group, if they're not going to be engaged on an ongoing, continuing basis. If, for example, they might be allowed to do other things, and they'll just be working in the business maybe 2 or 3 days a week. In that kind of scenario, you'd expect the seller to enter into some kind of consultancy agreement with the buyer group.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically we'll see a consultancy agreement where it's a part-time, relatively short-term kind of arrangement, more of a handover, an
Yeah.
employment contract, more perhaps where there's an earn-out for a couple of years. It's full-time.
Yes.
You're still supposed to be kind of effectively running the business post-transaction. So
Yes.
from an individual seller perspective, those are some of the things you might want to think about. But there are different issues that you potentially face if you're a corporate seller and you're selling one of the businesses in your group
Mm.
because you no longer need
Yeah.
it, or just it's you are better off disposing of it and using the
Yes.
capital in another part of your business.
Yes.
And obviously these groups are often quite tightly integrated. So you will have lots and lots of central services functions, be it HR, accountancy, purchasing, perhaps inventory management. You might have particular software systems that you're using across your whole group, which are potentially different from the buyer. So how would that be handled in an M&A transaction?
Yes, that's right. I think where you have a corporate seller effectively carving out, and again, it's almost a term of art where you have a carve out of part of the business of a corporate group, but that then gets sold to a buyer. As John says, that business may be very dependent on the systems of the overall seller group, and it's very difficult to have an immediate clean breaks. So typically what would happen is there'd be some kind of transitional services agreement that's put in place, and it may be 6 months, it may be up to 2 years, or maybe even longer, depending on the complexity of the arrangements. And essentially that will provide that the seller group will continue to provide certain essential services to enable this carved out business to continue operating as it moves to the buyer. What will ultimately happen is there'll be an integration of all the systems into the buyer's group. So the seller, the target that's just been carved out and bought by the buyer, will eventually migrate entirely onto the buyer's systems and become part of the buyer's processes and controls. But that can take time, depending on how complicated the business is.
And these are quite complicated, large contracts. From a seller's perspective, of course, you're going to get paid. You're going to negotiate a price for providing these services, but they can still be quite onerous, even if you're not even if you are being paid for them, because then your staff are focusing on somebody else's business, and you perhaps lose some of your flexibility as to what you can do with your own systems and the services that you're providing to other members of your group, because you need to be able to continue to do what you said you were going to do for the buyer. So key issues you're going to have to consider are things like price, but also term is going to be hugely important, because as the seller, you're going to want the buyer to be out of your systems and get this thing done broadly as quickly as possible. As the buyer, of course, you want to make sure it happens in an orderly manner with no disruption. So there's a real negotiation to be had there to make sure that people get it done promptly, but without rushing so much it makes a mess, which might perhaps impact on something like an earnout. Similarly, you want to be very clear as to what the service standards are. Both sides need to know what's expected. So if something breaks, how quickly you're supposed to fix it, whose responsibility is it, what's the response time, all of those kind of tricky questions that you would have with an outsourcing agreement, which is effectively what this is. So again, something that needs to be considered at an early stage in the transaction, because if it's 3 days before completion and you're like, oh, we need to do a transitional services agreement to keep running the accounts and the IT, then you're going to be in a real pickle, and it can potentially create delays.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, well, I think that's probably the end of this quick summary of things that people might like to think about in relation to a kind of post-transaction services. Glafkos, thanks again for taking the time to talk to me. Really appreciate it. I hope this has been useful. For anybody who has been watching, again, please do go and have a look at our YouTube channel. We do put all our videos on there. So if you like and subscribe, you'll get more of this content as we produce more of it, and hopefully that will help you. If you are thinking about selling your business, or if you've got a outsourcing agreement or a transitional services agreement or anything like that you're looking to enter into, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with Glafkos and I. We'd be delighted to advise. Thanks very much.
Thank you.